Keanu Reeves, one of Hollywood's most beloved stars, was known for his humble nature and his genuine kindness toward others. Yet, when the actor paid a visit to a small charity orphanage on the outskirts of the city, something unexpected happened. It wasn't just another celebrity visit. This time, Keanu noticed something important, something that stirred deep concern within him, something he knew he had to act on. Little did he know this visit would change everything for the children there, and for him too. It was a bright, chilly afternoon when Keanu arrived at the orphanage. The weather was cool, with a crisp breeze sweeping through the trees, but the sun shone brightly, casting long shadows over the small building. As Keanu stepped out of his car, the excited chatter of children could be heard from inside. The orphanage wasn't much, just a modest building, tucked away from the hustle and bustle of the city. But it was home to a group of children who had nowhere else to go. Despite its humble nature, the place radiated warmth, filled with laughter and a sense of belonging. Keanu, dressed casually in jeans and a hoodie, walked toward the entrance, his presence alone creating a buzz among the staff. He was known for being down-to-earth, and his quiet, thoughtful demeanor had made him a favorite among fans and strangers alike. The children, some of whom had seen his movies, were visibly excited as they awaited his arrival. As he entered the building, he was greeted with wide smiles, eager hands reaching out to shake his. Keanu greeted everyone with his trademark humility, his eyes twinkling as he knelt to chat with the kids at their level. But there was something about today that felt different, something in the air. As Keanu spent time with the children, playing games, and hearing their stories, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. At first, it was hard to put his finger on it, but the more he observed, the more he noticed small, almost unnoticeable details that didn't add up. The children's smiles, while genuine, seemed forced at times. There was an unease behind their laughter, a sadness that lingered in the background. It was as if they were hiding something they couldn't bring themselves to talk about. Keanu, ever the perceptive one, felt his concern grow. He asked one of the older children, a teenage boy named Malik, if everything was okay. Malik hesitated, his eyes darting toward the other kids before he spoke quietly. "It's nothing, Mr. Reeves. Just the way things are here, you know." Keanu noticed how Malik's voice trembled slightly, how his hands clenched into fists at his sides. There was something deeper, something more troubling beneath his words. Keanu's instincts kicked in. He knew that look. He had seen it before in the eyes of those who were struggling, those who felt trapped in situations they couldn't escape. His heart ached as he realized that something more than just a lack of material wealth was affecting these kids. He could sense their fear, their uncertainty. It wasn't just the building that needed saving, it was the children themselves. Something was happening at this orphanage, something that needed to be addressed. The actor continued to spend time with the children, watching their interactions, the way they spoke to one another, the way their faces lit up or dropped when they thought no one was looking. And then, just as he was about to leave, it happened. Keanu overheard a conversation between two staff members, their voices low and urgent. The words he caught sent a chill through him. "We can't keep doing this. It's too dangerous. They'll find out, and then we'll all be in trouble." Keanu's heart raced as he heard those words. What was going on here? What was so dangerous? And who was they? He tried to get closer, but the staff members noticed him approaching and quickly stopped talking, their faces suddenly turning stiff. But Keanu's instincts were sharp. Something was terribly wrong, and he wasn't about to walk away without getting to the bottom of it. He spent the next few hours talking to the children, asking subtle questions, looking for clues, anything that could explain the growing sense of unease he felt. The kids, though nervous, started to open up. Slowly, piece by piece, the story began to unravel. Keanu learned that the orphanage was struggling, not just financially, but in ways far more serious. There were rumors of mistreatment, stories of children being sent away to families who promised to adopt them, but never did. Some of the kids had disappeared without a trace, and no one knew where they had gone. The staff seemed overworked, some of them acting strangely distant or cold. And the worst part was that the children had no one to turn to. They were afraid, not just for themselves, but for each other. Keanu's mind raced as he pieced together the fragments of information. He knew something needed to be done, but the question was, what? He had the resources, the connections, and the influence, but even with all of that, he felt a sinking feeling in his stomach. What if he couldn't fix this? What if he was too late? As the day drew to a close, Keanu knew he couldn't leave without taking action. He couldn't just walk away, not when he had seen the fear in their eyes. Not when he had heard the whispers of something dark lingering behind the walls. But what could he do? The stakes were high, and there were people involved who didn't want their secrets exposed. Keanu's mind raced as he tried to come up with a plan, something that would make a difference without putting the children in even more danger. The sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the orphanage. Keanu stood outside, looking up at the sky, his thoughts swirling. He knew he had to do something. He couldn't leave it like this. He wasn't the type of person who would walk away when people needed help. But as he stood there, trying to gather his thoughts, he heard the faintest sound, a rustling behind him. Spinning around, Keanu's heart skipped a beat. There, standing in the shadows, was someone he hadn't expected to see, someone who could change everything. The figure stepped forward, and Keanu's breath caught in his throat as he realized who it was. The truth was about to come to light, but not in the way he had hoped. What happens next? What will Keanu do when he uncovers the shocking truth? And how will the children's fate be determined? All of these questions hang in the air, leaving Keanu, and everyone else, on the edge of their seats. The story is far from over, and it's clear that Keanu's visit to the orphanage is only the beginning of something much bigger. Stay tuned to find out how Keanu Reeves takes action and fights for the children's future. This is just the beginning, and the most important chapter is yet to come. Keanu stood frozen for a moment, his mind racing as he stared at the figure emerging from the shadows. His first instinct was to confront them, but something about the way the person moved, so quietly, almost cautiously, made him pause. The tension in the air thickened, a feeling of uncertainty creeping up his spine. He hadn't expected to see anyone else, especially not at this hour, and certainly not someone connected to the orphanage. But there they were, slowly stepping into the fading light of the setting sun. The figure was tall, dressed in a dark jacket, their face partially obscured by the hood they wore. Keanu's heart pounded in his chest as he tried to make sense of the situation. There was something unsettling about the person's presence, something that felt off. He hadn't seen them earlier when he was inside, and the fact that they were lingering around now at such a late hour only added to his suspicion. Was this someone who worked at the orphanage, or was this a stranger? "Who are you?" Keanu called out, his voice steady but with a hint of authority. The figure didn't flinch but instead stopped, standing just at the edge of the light. It was as if they were waiting for him to approach. Keanu took a step forward, but the figure remained silent. There was something in the way they stood, a posture that suggested caution, maybe even fear. Keanu knew that look. It was the same look he had seen in the eyes of countless people who had been through something traumatic, something they couldn't escape. His thoughts flashed to the children he had met earlier, their fearful eyes, their reluctance to speak up. This person, whoever they were, could hold the answers to the questions that had been swirling in his mind all day. The quietness stretched between them, heavy and thick. Keanu's eyes never left the figure as he carefully assessed the situation. He didn't want to scare them off, but he needed answers. "I'm not here to cause trouble," Keanu said softly, trying to sound reassuring, his voice carrying the warmth that had earned him the trust of so many over the years. "I just want to help. Please, if you know something, you can tell me. It's important." For a moment, the figure didn't move, as though contemplating whether or not to reveal themselves. Then, as if making a decision, they slowly pulled back the hood, revealing a face that Keanu recognized immediately. It was a young woman, not much older than some of the older kids at the orphanage. Her eyes were wide with fear, and her face was pale, as though she had been running for a long time. Her clothes were worn and tattered, a far cry from the neat uniforms the staff at the orphanage wore. "You don't know me," she said, her voice trembling. It wasn't a question but a statement, as though she was trying to convince herself. She glanced nervously around, as if expecting someone to appear from the shadows at any moment. Keanu took another step closer, his expression softening. "I'm Keanu. I've been visiting the children inside. I want to help. You don't have to be afraid." The woman's gaze flickered to the ground, her fingers ringing together as if trying to steady herself. I don't know how much help you can be," she muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. "But maybe you can help them. I think they're in danger." Keanu felt a chill crawl up his spine at her words. Danger? What kind of danger could these children possibly be in? They were already living in an orphanage, a place meant to provide them with safety, stability, a chance at a better life. But her expression, her fear, told a different story. "I don't understand," Keanu said, his voice low and careful. "What's going on here? What kind of danger are you talking about?" The woman hesitated, looking over her shoulder again before stepping a little closer, as if trying to make sure no one could overhear. Keanu leaned in slightly, trying to catch every word, every detail. The last thing he wanted was for her to clam up, to walk away without saying anything more. The orphanage. It's not what it seems, she began, her voice shaky but urgent. At first, I thought it was just me, you know. But then I started seeing things. Little things that didn't make sense. The children, she trailed off, her eyes darting around nervously. They're being sent away, Keanu. Sent to families, to people who don't want them. And some of them, they don't come back. They just disappear. Keanu felt a sharp pang in his chest. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fit together, but the picture it painted was far darker than he had imagined. Children disappearing. Families who didn't care what was going on behind those walls. Who's doing this? Keanu asked, his voice barely above a whisper, afraid of the answer. I don't know, she replied, her voice tight. But it's not just the orphanage. I think it goes deeper than that. There are people who don't want the truth to come out, people who would do anything to keep it hidden. I've seen things, Keanu. Things I can't explain. People in positions of power, people who are supposed to protect the kids, but they're not. They're part of it. Keanu felt a heavy weight settle in his chest as the gravity of her words hit him. Someone was exploiting the orphanage, using it as a cover for something far more sinister. And those children, the innocent ones, the ones who had already been through so much, were caught in the middle of it. He couldn't let this go. He couldn't just walk away. Why are you telling me this? Keanu asked. Why now? The woman's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them away quickly, as if determined not to show weakness. Because I'm scared, Keanu. I don't know who to trust anymore. I tried to go to the authorities, but it didn't work. They dismissed me. I don't know what to do, but I think you can help. You're different. You can make people listen. Keanu felt a surge of determination flood through him. He had to act. He couldn't let the children suffer like this. But as much as he wanted to jump into action, there was still so much he didn't know. Who was behind all this? And why were they targeting these children? The more Keanu thought about it, the more questions flooded his mind. But one thing was certain. He couldn't leave this orphanage until he had answers. Okay, Keanu said, his voice firm with resolve. I'll help, but we need to be careful. This is bigger than just a few kids. We're dealing with something dangerous here. The woman nodded, relief flooding her face for the first time since they had started talking. But even as she seemed to relax slightly, Keanu couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. Keanu felt the weight of the moment settle in. He had agreed to help, but now that he was in the thick of it, the enormity of the situation was sinking in. The woman, who still hadn't told him her name, was trembling slightly, but she stood her ground. There was a quiet resolve in her eyes, but it was clear that whatever was going on at the orphanage was terrifying, and the unknowns were weighing on her. Keanu could feel that same sense of uncertainty clawing at his chest. We need to move fast, he said, his voice steady but with a sense of urgency. I'll talk to the kids, see what I can find out. Maybe they know more than they're letting on. But we can't go in too heavy. Whoever's behind this, they got the power to keep it quiet. The woman nodded, glancing nervously around the street. She seemed agitated, like she wanted to say more but was afraid to. Keanu didn't press her further, but he could tell there was more she was holding back. Maybe she didn't want to implicate herself in whatever was happening, or maybe she was just scared. Whatever it was, he needed to get to the truth. The kids at the orphanage deserved that much. You said you tried going to the authorities, Keanu said as he turned to head back toward the orphanage. What happened there? Her face twisted with frustration. I went to the police, but they didn't believe me. I told them everything I knew, all the details, but they brushed me off. They said I was overreacting, that the kids were probably just being adopted by families outside the city. But I've seen things, Keanu. I know I'm not imagining this. Keanu didn't respond right away. He had seen too many cases where the authorities ignored the signs, too many times when people were dismissed because their stories were too outlandish to believe. The thought of someone dismissing the suffering of those children, of protecting the ones who were responsible for this, made him sick to the stomach. But now wasn't the time to get angry. They needed to keep their heads, stay calm, and gather evidence. Then, and only then, could they make their move. As they reached the orphanage again, the evening was creeping in, the light fading fast. The staff had begun to pack up, preparing to send the children off to their rooms for the night. Keanu felt a wave of apprehension wash over him as he entered the building once again. The tension was palpable, and the air felt heavy. He had been inside before, but this time it felt different. Now, knowing what he did, every creak of the floorboards and every whisper of conversation seemed like a clue. But nothing was clear yet. Keanu made his way toward the common room, where the children were gathered, some playing quietly, others sitting by the windows. The staff was still around, but they were busy organizing the evening activities. He could see the apprehension on the children's faces, The way they flinched whenever an adult walked too close, as if expecting to be reprimanded for something they hadn't done. It was subtle, but Keanu noticed it. His heart tightened. These kids weren't just scared, they were living in fear. As he walked through the room, Keanu's eyes scanned the faces of the children. He had to be careful, not wanting to make any of them feel cornered. He knelt beside a young girl who couldn't have been more than 6, her big brown eyes wide and curious. She was one of the quieter ones, sitting alone at the table, playing with some crayons. "Hey there," Keanu said gently, trying to put her at ease. "What's your name?" The girl looked up at him, her eyes flicking nervously to the adults in the room before answering in a small voice. "Emma." "Emma," Keanu repeated softly. "That's a beautiful name. You know, I've been hearing all sorts of good things about you today. You're really good at drawing, huh?" Emma's lips twitched into a small smile at the compliment, but her gaze was still wary. Keanu could tell that something was holding her back from fully trusting him. He leaned a little closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "Emma, I need to ask you something, okay? It's really important. Have you seen anything strange? Anything that made you feel scared or worried?" Emma's hand froze mid-crane stroke. Her eyes darted to the door, to the staff, then back to Keanu. For a long moment she didn't say anything, just sat there, her small shoulders tense. Keanu's heart clenched. She was so young, and yet she was already carrying the weight of something much bigger than she should have to. "Emma," Keanu said softly, his tone gentle but firm. "You're not in trouble. I just want to make sure you're safe. Can you tell me what's going on?" The girl's lip trembled slightly, and then, just as Keanu thought she might pull away, she whispered, "The people, they take the kids away. The ones who don't have anyone. They say they're going to a new home, but they don't come back." Keanu's stomach dropped. He looked into Emma's eyes and saw the quiet terror there, the fear that had been growing in her chest ever since the day she first heard the whispers. Keanu fought the rising anger in his chest, taking a deep breath before he spoke again. "Who takes them?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Emma looked around again, her small hand gripping her crayon tightly. She spoke so quietly that Keanu had to lean in to hear her. "The man who comes with the papers. He's tall. He has a briefcase. The staff. They don't stop him." Keanu's mind raced as he pieced together the bits of information. Someone with authority was taking these kids, making them disappear, and no one was stopping it. The thought of children being quietly stolen away, hidden under the guise of adoption, made his blood run cold. Just then, a staff member walked by, and Emma quickly ducked her head, her body tensing. Keanu stood up, giving her a reassuring smile before turning to face the rest of the room. The tension was thick in the air. It was clear that Emma wasn't the only one with something to hide. Keanu's mind was whirling. He had to act quickly, but he couldn't do this alone. Whoever was behind this had the power to silence people, to make them afraid to speak. Keanu had seen that kind of control before, and he knew how dangerous it could be. He had to gather more information, more witnesses, but how could he do that without tipping them off? How could he protect these kids if he couldn't even trust the people who were supposed to be taking care of them? As the evening drew on, Keanu knew one thing for sure. He wasn't walking away from this. Not until he had answers, not until he had the truth. The stakes were higher than he ever imagined, and with every passing minute, the walls seemed to be closing in tighter. But Keanu wasn't going to give up. Not now, not ever. The children needed him, and he wasn't about to fail them. Keanu's mind raced as he left the common room, his heart pounding in his chest. Emma's words echoed in his mind. The man with the briefcase. It felt like a piece of the puzzle was finally falling into place, but it was only a sliver of the truth. The sense of urgency was consuming him. He had to act quickly before anything else happened. The longer he stayed in the dark, the more these children would suffer, and the more dangerous this entire situation became. His first instinct was to confront the staff, to demand answers, but something told him that would be a mistake. Whoever was behind this had power, connections, and likely a few tricks up their sleeve. Keanu couldn't afford to make a wrong move. Not now, not with so much at stake. He had to be careful. He had to be smart. Keanu's eyes scanned the orphanage, taking in every detail as he tried to figure out his next step. He could sense the fear lingering in the hallways, almost like an invisible weight pressing down on the building. The place had always seemed welcoming, safe, even a little hopeful. But now it felt cold, like a facade built on secrets. He needed more information, more evidence. He couldn't just rely on whispers from a frightened child. He had to find concrete proof, something that could bring this entire operation into the light. But where would he find that proof? And who could he trust to help him? The sound of footsteps behind him broke his concentration. Keanu spun around, instinctively reaching for the phone in his pocket, but it was only the woman from earlier, the one who had warned him about the danger in the first place. Her face was drawn tight with worry, and she moved quickly toward him. "Keanu," she whispered urgently, glancing over her shoulder. "I've heard something. I think it's happening tonight." Keanu's heart skipped a beat. Tonight. He didn't know what she meant, but he knew it wasn't good. "What's going to happen?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady, though the panic was starting to build within him. "They're taking the kids tonight. The man with the briefcase will be here soon, and when he does, he'll be taking more of them. I overheard the staff talking. They said it was already arranged." She stopped for a moment, her eyes scanning the darkened hallway as though she expected someone to appear at any moment. "I don't know why, but they're preparing everything. They've been hiding it from the other staff, even the ones who care. They've been paid off. Everyone is in on it, but they're keeping it quiet." Keanu felt the blood drain from his face. The man with the briefcase was coming. He couldn't waste any more time. The plan he had in mind suddenly seemed too risky, but there was no turning back. If he didn't act tonight, it might be too late for the kids. "Where's the office?" Keanu asked, his voice calm but urgent. He needed to know where the paperwork, the real proof, was kept. If he could get to the files, he might be able to expose everything. "Down the hall," she said, pointing toward the back of the building. "Second door on the left, but you have to be quick. If they catch you—" "I know," Keanu interrupted, his mind already racing with a plan. He couldn't afford to be caught. He needed to get in, grab whatever he could, and get out. He glanced at the woman, his expression softening for a moment. "Thank you. You've already helped more than you know." She nodded, a faint look of gratitude crossing her face. "Just don't let them take the kids, Keanu. They won't come back." He nodded, his jaw tightening. He had already made up his mind. He wasn't leaving without answers. Keanu moved quickly, keeping to the shadows as he made his way down the hallway toward the office. Every step felt heavier than the last. He could feel the clock ticking down, and with each passing moment, the tension in the air seemed to grow thicker. The orphanage, once a place of hope, now felt like a ticking time bomb ready to go off. As Keanu approached the office door, he noticed something odd. The hallway was unnervingly quiet, too quiet. He had expected to hear the usual sounds of the orphanage, kids playing, staff walking through the halls, but it was eerily still. It was as if the building itself had fallen into a tense silence, holding its breath. Keanu's hand hovered over the doorknob, and for a moment, he hesitated. Something didn't feel right. He glanced behind him once more, but the hallway was empty. There was no one there. He quickly turned the handle and slipped inside the office. The room was dimly lit, the only light coming from a small desk lamp near the back. Keanu's eyes quickly scanned the room, searching for anything that could give him the answers he needed. Papers were scattered across the desk, but there was no sign of a briefcase. His fingers brushed over the papers, flipping through them quickly, his heart pounding in his chest. Most of the files were about adoptions, placements, and children being moved to new homes. But one file stood out. Its edges were worn, as though it had been handled many times before. Keanu opened it, his breath catching in his throat as he saw the names listed inside. These weren't ordinary adoption records. The names were linked to different cities, even different countries, but there was a deeper connection that wasn't immediately obvious. These were not just children being adopted, they were being moved, disappeared. Just as Keanu was about to dig deeper into the file, he heard footsteps in the hallway. He froze, his heart pounding. Someone was coming. He had to move, and fast. Without thinking, Keanu grabbed the file and shoved it into his jacket. He had no time to waste. As he turned to leave, the office door creaked open, and Keanu's blood ran cold. A figure stood in the doorway, their face barely visible in the shadows. It was him, the man with the briefcase. Keanu's body tensed. He couldn't let him see him. Not now, not when he was so close to getting the proof he needed. He had to act quickly. But the man wasn't alone. Behind him, Keanu could make out two more figures, their faces hidden under dark hoods. The staff. They were part of this. Had known it, but seeing them in the flesh was different. Keanu's mind raced. There was no way out of this without a confrontation. He needed to make his move. The man with the briefcase stepped into the office, his sharp eyes scanning the room as if he already knew something was off. Keanu's heart was pounding in his chest. He stood frozen, barely breathing, trying to blend into the shadows. But it was clear the man wasn't here for a casual visit. His posture was rigid, his gaze calculating, and his grip on the briefcase tight. The two hooded figures behind him entered, their movements silent, deliberate. Keanu could feel the air growing colder, as if the very walls of the orphanage were closing in. He had only moments before they noticed him, before they made the connection that he wasn't supposed to be there. His fingers tightened around the file in his jacket, and his mind raced, looking for an escape route. The man with the briefcase didn't seem to move, but Keanu could feel his eyes, piercing through the darkness, scanning the room with unsettling precision. It wasn't just suspicion. It was something else, something deeper, like he was waiting for Keanu to make the first move. "Where is it?" the man asked, his voice calm but cold. The words were directed at the staff, but there was an underlying threat in them. Keanu's pulse quickened. The file he had taken, it was what they were looking for, and the way the man spoke made it clear that whatever was in it was important. But why? One of the hooded figures nodded toward the desk. "It's been taken. Someone's been snooping around." Keanu's breath caught in his throat. He hadn't expected the search to be this immediate, this precise. They weren't just concerned about the children. They were looking for something bigger, something that might expose everything. And now he had what they wanted. The second figure moved toward the desk, their gloved hands sweeping over the papers with quick, practiced movements. Keanu felt a chill run down his spine. If they found out what he'd taken, he was done for. The stakes had just escalated, and he had no idea how far this went, how dangerous these people really were. "Nothing here," the first figure muttered, turning back toward the man with the briefcase. "We need to search the rest of the building. The file can't be far." Keanu's mind screamed at him to move. He had no time to think, no time to plan. He had to get out, but the only way out was past them. The door was blocked, and every exit seemed sealed shut by their presence. He had no choice but to confront them head-on, even if it meant risking everything. "Wait," the man with the briefcase said suddenly, his voice soft but commanding. "You, the one who's been interfering." Keanu froze. His heart skipped a beat, and for a split second, he thought the man was speaking directly to him. But then he turned his gaze to the staff, and Keanu realized they were the ones under suspicion. The tension in the room thickened as the briefcase man's cold stare landed on one of the staff members who'd been working late into the night. Yudi said again, stepping forward, "You've been telling people things, haven't you? Spreading rumors. We don't tolerate that kind of behavior here. Not anymore." Keanu watched as the staff member's face paled, their eyes darting nervously between the figures in the room. They were cornered, and Keanu could see the panic starting to set in. It was clear they knew something about the operation, something that could bring everything crashing down. And the more Keanu watched, the more he realized that the staff member wasn't just involved. They were afraid, terrified. "Please," the staff member whispered, their voice shaking. "I didn't mean to." The briefcase man raised a hand, silencing them. "You've already done enough," he said, his tone cold and final. "Now it's time to clean up." Keanu's gut twisted. The words felt like a death sentence. He had known something terrible was going on, but hearing it out loud, hearing the casual way the man spoke of cleaning up, made it all too real. This wasn't just about stolen children or shady adoptions. This was something far darker. Before Keanu could react, the man with the briefcase turned sharply, his eyes scanning the room again. His gaze briefly flickered over the corner where Keanu had hidden himself, and for a terrifying moment, Keanu thought he had been spotted. The man's eyes narrowed slightly, but he didn't say anything. Instead, he turned back to the staff member, signaling to the others to leave the office. The staff member was dragged out by the hooded figures, the door slamming shut behind them with a sickening finality. Keanu let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. His body was shaking now, but he couldn't afford to stay frozen. He had a limited window to act, and if he didn't do something now, the consequences could be disastrous. As he moved toward the door, he heard something that made his blood run cold. A faint sound, a whisper of movement, coming from the hallway just beyond the office. Someone else was there. Someone else had been listening. Keanu's heart thudded painfully in his chest. Who else knew about what was going on here, and why had they stayed silent? Suddenly, the door to the office opened again. Keanu stepped back into the shadows, praying he hadn't been seen. The figure in the doorway was not the briefcase man. It wasn't any of the hooded figures either. Instead, it was a young girl, no older than 12, with wide, terrified eyes. She looked like she had seen a ghost. Keanu's mind raced. How long had she been there? Had she overheard too much? The girl's eyes locked onto his, and for a moment, neither of them moved. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she spoke. "They're going to take us. All of us. Tonight." Keanu's stomach churned and every muscle in his body tensed. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but they weren't making any sense. The girl didn't just seem frightened. She seemed to know something about what was happening, something that no one else had figured out yet. The stakes were higher than ever. This wasn't just about children being moved to new homes. This was about something far worse, something so dangerous that even the staff were terrified of what they might lose if they spoke out. Keanu reached out slowly, his voice barely a whisper. "What do you mean? What's really going on here?" The girl shook her head, her face pale with fear. "I can't say, but you have to stop them. You have to stop them tonight, or we'll never get out." Before Keanu could ask anything else, the girl darted out of the room, disappearing down the hall, her footsteps echoing in the silence. He stood there for a moment, his mind racing. He had thought he was close to the truth, but now he realized he was barely scratching the surface. Whatever was happening, whatever the people behind this were planning, it was far bigger and more dangerous than he had ever imagined. Keanu clenched his fists, determination flooding through him. There was no turning back now. He had to stop them. But how? The clock was ticking, and with every minute, the danger grew. The suspense was unbearable, and Keanu knew that if he didn't act soon, he might lose everything and everyone he was trying to save.